Hi, everyone. So happy everyone can make it. Let's get this started. Yevinewi, Yosen Chamanyawu, Kechemaliawe Wariam, Enepo Karina Bañuelos Deak, Inachai, San Miguel de Orcasitas Hoa, Kete Hiakvatwe, Itepo Emo Ute Boituk Ye, Yo Eme Ekaxkane, Inepo Shivagna Po Yoituk, Kaita Chivo, and Hoeme Iyori. Greetings, Creator be with you all and hope you are healthy relatives. My name is Karina Bañuelos. My family is traditionally from San Miguel de Orcasitas in Sonora, Mexico, but came from the Yaqui River. I am proud to be a descendant of the Yoeme and Caxton peoples. I was born and raised in Los Angeles in a Tongva village site called Shivagna, which is north of Whittier Narrows, close to the second location of Mission San Gabriel. Thank you all for joining us. It is customary for Indigenous peoples to introduce themselves by way of acknowledging where and who we come from. I wanted to honor this space in that good way in my traditional language. The land on which we virtually gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking UP tribe. The Yamamutsin tribal band, composed of the descendants of Indigenous people stolen and taken to missions in Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working diligently to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. The California mission system is what Lisjan Ohlone activist Karina Gold calls the first prison industrial complex of California. Missions that still stand today serve as a burning reminder of the devastation that the Spanish brought onto California natives everywhere. The legacy of colonization cannot exist independently from the centuries of often fatal forced labor and economic extraction of enslaved Africans across the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America. We must acknowledge that most of what we know of this country today, including culture, economic, and development, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the horrors of transatlantic trafficking and chattel slavery. We additionally honor the low wage and forced labor of immigrant Latinx and Asian relatives who have contributed and continue to contribute to the building of this country. We must honor their presence in the spirit world and in the living as past, present, and emerging in our collective and ongoing efforts for self-determination, freedom, and sovereignty. I have the amazing honor to introduce my mentor and scholar activist, Dr. Andrew Jolivette. He is a professor and department chair of ethnic studies, as well as their inaugural founding director of Native American and Indigenous studies at UC San Diego. He is the author of 9 books in print and forthcoming, including the Lammy Award nominated Indian Blood, HIV and Colonial Trauma in San Francisco's Two-Spirit Community. With his recent release, Louisiana Creole Peoplehood, Afro-Indigeneity Community. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hey, everybody. It's great to be with you. Great to be here. I just want to take a moment to introduce myself a little more traditionally. And then actually, I want to share 2 poems just for some context for what the conversation that we're going to be having today. Yutolwi Hokisat Kus Andrew Jolivette, Tisikip Opolusa Takapa Ishak Hiek the Ishak. Good morning, relatives. My name is Andrew Jolivette. I descend from the Tisikip Opolusa Huron clan of the Attakapaw Ishak Nation, born of the Sunrise peoples at the eastern side of the Attakapaw traditional homelands in southwest Louisiana. I am the son of Annetta and Kenneth, grandson of Isabel and Andrew, Gertie and Howard, the great-grandson of Leela and Curtis, Eva and Edward, Rosina and Francois, and Allie and Eli. I was born in Yalamu, the traditional unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone, and what is today called San Francisco. Today, I want to acknowledge the traditional unceded Kumeyaay territory at the man-made colonial border between what is known as San Diego and Mexico, where I'm speaking to you from this morning. I want to also recognize and acknowledge and stand in kinship with the Indigenous peoples and the territories where you all come from. Please feel free to acknowledge the Indigenous nations where you were born or that you are a member of in the chat. And if you're unsure, I am posting a link where you can check what traditional territory you are on. So before we dive into the dialogue and conversation this morning, I was thinking about It's Black History Month, thinking about the relations between Indigenous peoples, African Indigenous peoples, American Indian Indigenous peoples, those who are actually both, the challenges that we face, and most importantly, the ways in which we continue to thrive even in the face of some of these challenges, but wanted to give a little context. So for all the Indians and Indigenous peoples who are told they aren't Indian or Indigenous, what does it mean when your CDIB, what does it mean when blood doesn't remember? What does it mean when your CDIB card trumps cultural practice, kinship, and blood memory? Where do the waters bend at the sight of bound peoples and remove names and bodies when no one knows you, but you pull your card? Does your grandmother care about a card if you can't even stitch? Stitch the stories of your memory and kinship, stitch the bones of red and black and white bodies, stitch the patterns of ongoing thrivance and ceremony. What does it mean when blood doesn't remember that we are more than a colonial story, a trauma, a disease? What does it mean when white passing academics without cards stand at violent gates, they becoming the masters, the self-selected arbiters? How colonial of you to tell me or them who we are. Have you looked in your own oppressor mirror? Does what reflects back terrify you so horribly that you seek only to destroy? They will come for you. They will come for us. They will erase themselves in their own violence, in fears of their own inadequacies. Who chooses what words, events, histories are enough? Is the oral tradition of my making not as true or as red as your card? And what of your card when they terminate? Do your people even know you? Do you exist without it? Is it only ancestors' names that get you remembered? Who knows your name in community? What blasphemy exists? Your mission becomes erasure and destruction of community in the name of real Indians. But who told you that you get to decide that shit? Anti-Blackness and even anti-Indianness in the guise of theory, but where is the practice? Let's make a new space and center whiteness and then turn on one another along the way to the darkness. We, the dark ones, and yes, some of the light ones, become the targets of your crusade, of your violence, of your own insecurity. What does it mean when blood doesn't remember blood? When Indigenous becomes a method of exclusion and fatal citizenship? My name is my name. My heartbeat is my heartbeat. My ken are my ken. And yet here I walk. The next conference, a sea of white faces, just another colonial exclusionary association, a conference without kinships, an organization, a media organization without kinship. White faces calling out other white faces in a space no blood recognizes. You have no right. You only decide your own path, not his, not hers, not theirs. Blood of my blood, ancestor of my ancestor. I carry to the fire each and every one of you, leaving no blood memory behind. I call out to you, not in theory, not in books, not conferences, but here on bayou waters and red dirt. This Black Indian discourse is more than a trend, a moment. It's a history, a kinship maze, a knot, a root never broken. Those who use paper wear masks themselves, masks of colonizers and terrorists. Rob us no more. We are blood memory, floating and rising, floating and rising, floating, rising, rising to the top of waterways and ceremonies where we dance, where we sing, where we remember. I'll take you to the water. I'll take the water over your memory, over your paper any day. I'll take the kinship over your citizenship any day. I'll take the blood memory over terror any day. We are here, you can't unmake us. Unmake us as they have unmade you. Your card becomes every removal, every dispossession, every scream, every trauma. And here, we without the paper, without the cards, we sit in our kinship, gather in our blood memory, knowing we are our ancestors' legacy. I don't need you to see me. They know me. They live in my breath, in my commitment, in my strength. Because what does it mean when blood doesn't remember? So, good morning.
In other words, good morning. I was saying, oh, the entire time. It's a big California Indian way to say that I feel that. That was beautiful, Andrew. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we're going to be starting in our questions here, which is an excellent segue. What can we learn from Black and Indigenous history, activism, and contemporary stewardship efforts in order to transform systems and even entertainment at a place like Netflix?
I want to start with Netflix in that question, I think, right? Or just media period, right? I think about new shows, Res Dogs, and others that have come out. I think that we need to transform the way that we think about an imagined story. I mean, programs like Gentefied, for example, right, which was, I guess, recently not renewed. I wasn't happy to hear that. That we think about, it's a balance, right? I think sometimes of thinking about what's profitable and what's meaningful, right? And so I think when I think about, stewardship and what that histories and legacies of struggle, I think about the Red Power movement. I think about the occupation of Alcatraz. I think about, you mentioned Karina Gould, and I think about the work of Indigenous women, Black Indigenous women, American Indian, California Native Indigenous women, and Two-Spirit folks, those who are often most marginalized. There's a scholar, Kathy Cohen, who wrote this book, The Boundaries of Blackness. And it looks at the breakdown of Black politics and during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And in it, she talks about the fact that because we have so much respectability politics sometimes, that after the civil rights movement, it was really difficult for a lot of Black folk who were kind of trying to define a political agenda to include those who are most marginalized, right? I think about, so folks who maybe were engaged in sex work or people who are LGBTQ, right? And so what she says is that those people are often at the periphery and become further marginalized. And so for me, I think about the folks who, in the face of intergenerational trauma, I think about this idea of soul wound, soul loss. It's a concept that Native writers, Bonnie Duran, who's a cousin of mine, and Eduardo Duran write about in their book, Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. But they talk about this idea of a soul wound. And I don't know how many of you remember the film many years ago, and everybody was like, oh, Hollywood finally did a great film on race relations. And all of us, many of us in the community were like, no, they didn't. This film is not really engaging. We still have the motif of the white savior in the film, or Matt Dillon's character, right? And then what happens, we see at the end with Andy Newton's character. And so, I think we have to really look at organizations, right? Not just organizations, but also one of the things I talk a lot about, and I think as many of groups, whether it's Google or Netflix or any number of the other orgs out there that are doing DEI type work, that it's not just about having folks come in and talk. It's about creating a new culture, an institutional culture. And I think that Black and Indigenous communities have often had to do. We've had to lead in forcing the country to look at itself and its weaknesses and its shortcomings, and to care more about this land that is stained with our blood and our ancestors' blood and that memory, and to still produce things like jazz, to produce things like the blues, which, let me say, right, these are things that both Native American and African American people have contributed to think about our foodways, to understand the intermingling of these cultural groups, at the intersection in the southeastern part of the United States when colonization was first taking place here. I think about Colombia and the Atlantic coast. I think about Nicaragua and the Garifuna, that we don't talk about Afro-Indigeneity and people in Lumbee or Maya tribe or the Louisiana Creole people who maintain, right, through joy, through thrivance, not just resistance and survivance, that we are still here and maintaining cultural traditions long ago, right? We have to, salsa music is African and indigenous music. We don't talk about it that way sometimes. Soul food is American Indian food, the one pot dish, as much as it is Black food, right? Greens, cornbread, all these things we eat. We don't talk about the shared cultural things. Sometimes we do talk about the shared struggle. I'm here to say that, you know, in the words of Eve Tuck, who's written about this, First Nations Canadian scholar, let's suspend the damage, the trauma, and move away from that and move toward this idea of radical love, which I like to talk a lot about. And I guess one of the things I would say, like just that I would also add that we can learn in terms of the stewardship efforts is, I was talking about all these different, you know, media orgs and things like that. What they can do is, when they do that DEI work, it's often about allyship, and we talk about how can we be in solidarity and allyship. And I think what we can learn from African, Afro-Indigenous, American Indian, California Native people, Two-Spirit people, is that we don't want allyship. Allyship is transactional. We want kinship. We want meaningful relationships. Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is the head of this, our founding bishop at the City of Refuge, a non-denominational, queer-friendly, I would say, space in the Bay Area. She said, I remember once at a talk, she said, God, it's so transactional. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. That's an alliance. That's allyship. That's when people were talking about Black Lives Matter out on the street here in San Diego and Kumeyaay territory, that I watched from my apartment window at the time as people marched for George Floyd. And I see, where are the Black faces? Where are the Native faces that, in some sense, when we look to the histories of Native and African peoples, we see land dispossession, we see the enslavement of both of these communities. I think what we, you know, sometimes forget is that there was a lot of paternalism that was happening then, right? That this country has tried to control the ways that we represent these two communities. And so while it's great that we have more and more of these images, I think about shows like Pose, for example, that sort of highlight these issues, but then even a show like Pose, right, that talks a bit more about Blackness and trans identity and Afro-Latin identity. It was interesting because what you then saw and learned, not through the show and the media representation, but through the folks who were actually on the show that were like, I don't identify with Latinx per se, I'm Indigenous, right? So what these things actually mean, I think in terms of how do we connect, how do we thrive, how do we suspend damage, a discourse that we're living in trauma, and how do we move to a place of thrivance? And so I think one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways that we can be good relatives is to be in kinship with one another, and rather than be in solidarity, which is also seems temporary based, is to be in ceremony with one another, right? And so if you work at Netflix, how do you see your work as ceremonial work? And when you see your work as ceremony, how does that shift the way that you think about it, not as a job, as a deep responsibility to something greater than yourself, to the representations, the images that you, for the children that are come? Because when we think about a history that mascots, right, Redskins, that no one really ever talked about the fact why that was so offensive. Bloody Redskins were paid for, bounties were placed on the heads of Indian men, women, and children. $6, $5, $4. That's why. When we think about people saying political correctness or being upset, people watched their relative, their children, hung and burned alive. that we are standing here is a testament to Thrivance, to joy, and I think it's so important. So yeah.
Beautifully said. I'm actually lighting some medicine for that. Goes into my next question perfectly. You've spoken on many panels and discussed this pushback against the idea of mattering and moving into a place where we are beyond mattering, but are thriving. What inspired this shift in thinking? You spoke a little bit about it in your previous answer, and I want you to also expand on the concept of Thrivance. What is Thrivance?
I will, and I'm going to show you all something, and I'm going to do, and I think I'm just going to do one more so we can talk, but I'm going to do a poem that gets at what I think talking about here. So this one is called Black Futurity, Black Joy. No more crying in pain, no more dying in vain. Hallelujah sings a choir of ghosts on broken ankles. Angels sprinkle white freedom dust. They rise from fields, they rise from ships. No more crying in pain, no more dying in vain. Abolition still aligned. Black death fills their cups once more. Black futures unseen in cotton. Black futures unseen in bars and orange fabrics. Black futures unseen on grass fields where cleats unearthed their blood. Let me pause and add this in because I didn't write it. And they won't hire Black NFL coaches. Not one more Django, nor Antebellum, nor Get Out. Not even the Roots. We stand, we fight, we create circuits, pools of imagination designed by grace. Multiple pathways together in song and in light we become. We become connectors, rebuilding, restitching every fabric, rebuilding every Tulsa, every Congo square, imagining that new Harlem, that Oaktown magic, that Caribe beat in Brazil and NOLA, Mardi Gras, Carnaval. Life is living. We are conduits. We are faster than the speed of our own sound. Jazz, Coltrane, Davis, blues, BB, Holiday. We aren't strange fruit. We are first fruit. We are beginning. We are infinite. Black circuits to kinship. Black circuits to waterways. Black circuits to ancestors. We are joy. We are joy. We are joy. Our future is in one another. Our future is in the circuit. Our future is in the ceremony. In the wiping of the whip-stained cracks on our backs, in the wiping of the branded initials etched in our flesh, radical in our love for one another, radical in our song of songs to one another. I am Black joy. I am a circuit. I am your medicine. You are Black joy. You are a radiant Black circuit. You are my medicine. You are our medicine. Each connector, each circuit's energy produce the light for our futures, for our joy. Black futures are Black joy. Black circuits are the routes to liberation, the routes to exhalation. Breathe in, my relative. Respira. Sing a song again, dance a dance again. You there, Black freedom, I see you. You there, Black circuitry, I see you. You there, Black futurity, I see you. You are Black joy, you are Black joy, you are Black joy. How do we live in joy? How do we see places like Oakland where Black folk produced a Black Joy parade that said we refuse to be represented in that way, right? How do we think about the sacred shell mound sites in Berkeley, Emeryville area that Karina Gould and other Ohlone relatives have taken back to say, this is our ancestors' land? So important, right? And so I want to just share briefly here, particularly from my tribal community. We have this concept, Wihokisakus. And I'm sharing with you on the screen this Louisiana Indigenous Thrivance model. Wihokisakus means we are all related, or we all connected, we are all relatives. And so you can see in the center here, the term Wihokisakus, that means all of us, right? All living things. But that we can't have medicine, which means we can't have healing when we don't have relationships, when we don't build kinship. We can't have ceremony without the medicine and the water and the land. So we have to see all those things as interconnected. And only when we do that, can we really resist? Can we really not even resist? I think this is what stewardship means, right? It means that I have a responsibility to something besides myself. If my student, and let me just take it out of theory or talk more practically, if a student calls me and says, hey, I need help, right, or someone's messaging me even right before this talk and is, people are asking for things, you kind of respond to it, right? But we also have to, of course, we want our self-care. We have to take time for ourselves. And at the same time, we sometimes forget what these things are. And a friend of mine who's Yaqui, he said to me a long time ago, I remember he said this, and I always sort of share this. He says, Creator gave us 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth for a reason. So look and listen first before speaking. And I think one of the things we need to do, right, is to have more humility, right? What does it mean to have more humility? And so Thrivance circuitry is this idea. I've been talking to folks in higher ed or other nonprofit sectors, and I'll share with all of you, is that how do we create Thrivance hubs? So when you think about your work sector, how do you create a space where people can thrive? We live in a country, this is also what we can learn from Black and Indigenous folks, that is supposed to be a meritocracy, where what you do in your individual efforts, right, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of mentality, oh, well, that's the choice they made. Even in our own families, though, we see that doesn't happen, right? We can have a sibling, maybe someone's incarcerated, someone else is a college professor, whatever it might be, right? That's because the structure of the system works in a particular way, where you can have a president of the United States who's a Black man and be, racially targeted and hijacked, right? If you think about some of the things we saw when President Obama was in the White House, built by slaves, enslaved African people, I should say, that had a mass crowd with guns been in front of the White House, and Tim Wise, who writes on white privilege, a white scholar, has said this, right? Had that been George Bush and a group of Black men armed with guns, right? Or even just the Capitol issue last year in January, right before Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office. Had that been a majority Black American Indian group, they would have been shot and killed, right? So we see those kind of double standards, but I think what we want to do is really talk about who we are as opposed to always responding to. So Thrivance is about, the way I've defined it is that it's where we take collectively the pain, the trauma, the joy, the healing, right? Radical love is about vulnerability that I wrote about, right? Only when we can be vulnerable and share our stories with others, right, like us, can we begin to truly heal. And so from that place of radical love, from that place of healing, when we start to not only do the organizing work of like the American Indian movement or the Black Panthers or all these, folks throughout history who have made this, quote, criminal justice system at least a little bit more just, that's only been possible because they were working toward Thrivance, right? Bringing, again, all those, and so each of you listening today is a circuit, right? You're part of, you all connect. And if we see all of our work is connecting to one another, right, as a relative, as kinship, not allies, then how do we make the full system, if it's Netflix, right, that we're talking about in that context, how do you help Netflix thrive? Is that all those connecting points, all those circuits, that the full sum of who you are, that beauty, that sacredness. I don't know how many of you have ever heard this or someone has told you this. You are sacred. You are designed for a reason, and you are, one in a constellation of many gifts that Creator has created for us. And so that's a responsibility we have to spread those circuits, spread that Thrivance, create those hubs where we actually don't just do land acknowledgements or labor acknowledgements, that we actually create opportunities and spaces so that there are more American Indians and Black employees and shows and programs. But not only that there are these visual representations, but actually the people who actually come up with the concepts, who write the shows, who decide, right? See the same kind of tired motifs that represent Black and Native people. And I think we saw this during COVID a lot, right? I think is another way that we can learn. Black folk and Native folk and Afro-Indigenous folk really jumped up real quick and created a lot of resources to support one another in community. I think about the Indian collective that emerged. I think about, some of the think tanks in Black communities that responded to what was happening and refused, right, to be in a place of simple resiliency. We talk about, we want to be resilient. So some Maori scholars, and then we can move to the next one, long ago said, you American Indian folks really talk a lot about resilience. And they said, I don't know about that. It's kind of like these old plastic dolls that they had a long time ago. Some of you who are older maybe remember them. They had sand in the very bottom, because I don't know if they make them anymore, maybe they do. But they had sand in the bottom, they were kind of clear and plastic, and you'd punch it and you'd hit it and it would just pop back up like this. So you just push it down and come back up. They said that's resilience. You stay in the same place and you never move forward. You're always responding to. We have to stop responding to. So it's about not just being surviving or resisting. It's about, or responding to the things that happen to us. It's about being proactive about saying, this is what we care about. This is what we articulate. And it's about relearning our languages. It's about then relearning them and teaching it to others, or our food ways and traditions, and focusing on those things that bring us that joy, not just that trauma.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a really important distinction that we're making as we're transitioning outside of mattering. And we all know we matter, right? We all matter. And we all deserve to thrive. I think your connection with us being sacred and us being part of a greater collection of different circuits, and, creator makes no mistake. And so we're all here with our own purpose to move forward in a way that is healing for the generations before us and the generations to come. So thank you for that. You spoke a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm definitely going to pick your brain a little bit here. But we live in a culture where diversity, equity, and inclusion are becoming the new normal in our corporate landscape, particularly in places like Netflix, where our platforming of diverse stories around the globe have a real life impact. What are some of the main pitfalls in how DEI work is approached? And are there ways to incorporate the philosophies of Thrivance, radical love, and relational embodiment into our day-to-day?
So, sorry folks, DEI is an institutional system meant to protect universities, corporations, because in the face of all pushbacks, right, DEI is about, it's this sort of, some of you, in universities, we have something called IRB, or Institutional Review Boards, Human Subjects Protocols. This is where we go and have to get research approved before we can go out, so we don't do any harm, right? You think about Henrietta Lacks. Some of you may be familiar with Henrietta Lacks' story, whose body was used without her consent, a Black woman, over years, and she died of cancer, and her cells were used, right, to actually lead to many breakthroughs in disease treatments, particularly around cancer, but other areas as well. And so these organizations exist to do that, but they're not really concerned. They don't really care. They just don't want to get sued, right? And so DEI, I think, is in some ways become this thing, because diversity, right, is, we just want physical diversity, or we just want to be included. It's not enough, right? We want transformative justice, right? So that means that even the ways in which we organize have to be really different. And so, institutionalizing DEI is really about a kind of saving face, or it's kind of a performative, what we would call kind of performative behavior, right? Let's bring out some people, show the diversity folks. It's like, okay, let me be more specific because I don't want to get too academic. Y'all saw the Super Bowl, right? I mean, yeah, let's bring out all the old time Black like hip hop crew, but we ain't gonna hire no Black head coaches, right? Or you know, we're gonna have the white man can kneel down Eminem, which actually, in fairness to him, he actually to do it and he did it anyway, right? So that's him being a good relative, right? And being in kinship, not necessarily an ally, I think. But at the same time, what is the performative nature of that? Or I can remember the Olympics, and like this is when Mitt Romney actually was the head, and it was in Utah, and I was mortified. They were like trying to do their diversity stuff, and so they brought out these Native people to open up things, and then next they had the audacity to have covered wagons and settlers marching across this field where it was just kind of like, oh, let's just show this on the screen and tell you what we did. Like they don't exist anymore, right? So I think that, and I love that, someone saying in here, DEI is not decolonization or liberation. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that, and what does decolonization mean, right? I think that that's great that you raised that, because I think that should be a starting place, and that should be the conversation, because even if the DEI work is done within a colonial context, it's still colonial then, right? If we're not controlling or are able to talk about what that, looks like, we don't want just to be represented. We want the way in which you treat us to be different. So I think that's the fatal flaw of DEI, and DEI is meant to serve and protect the corporate space, and to also dilute very radical work, transformative work, right? I don't even know if it's meant to be reformative. Like I always ask people, is the goal of this work to reform or transform society, right? Cornel West had this famous, I think, quote, and I always kind of say, I don't know about if I agree with you. He is justice is what love looks like. And I said, that's nice. I said, I think it really justice is what love looks like in the light, right? Because undocumented folks, right? Their love is criminalized oftentimes. You can't see it, right? Or it'd be public for fear of deportation. Indigenous love, right? And Black love and Afro-Indigenous love, right? Queer love is not always able to just be visible, right? And so I think that it has to be something that when we see it, we don't judge it. I think about all the videos, right, that went around of these people calling the police on Black folks, or I think about the image of the Native elder in Washington, D.C., who had these youth banging a drum in his face during some of the Capitol kind of protests and things as well. I think about the battles even right now in the state of California. I was just talking to some friends. They just passed a new bill to remove the word squaw from monuments. They have to hire someone, DEI. Guess how much they're paying them? And they're non-native people. They're all non-native who are they're hired to do this. And I was talking to my friend. They said, "Oh yeah, they're paying them $100,000 to help facilitate the Indians and the other people who are going to help kind of, consult to get rid of the either monuments or landmarks like Squaw Valley." And for those of you that don't know, right, squaw is a reference to female anatomy, vagina, or a woman, right? That the way in which you get used, it's inappropriate and offensive, but it's also something that has been used by colonists. There's so many things, right, that we have to push back. I love the 49ers and I'm a football fan, but we also I have to say it too, right? If I'm gonna call out others, I got to call them too, right? They probably shouldn't be renaming themselves the San Francisco 49ers, because that whole system of gold mining, right, was about the murder of California natives. And so gold rush, all those things are also deeply offensive. We have to look at the cultural, what are called signifiers, right? These kind of things that exist out in society, out in our world, out in our workplaces, in our families, in our homes, and really challenge them. and resist them. So yes, it's not about DEI, it's about decolonization. And it's not even just about decolonization, because I think, where do we go back? Are we going back to something? Are we, right? So as I tell people sometimes, we don't think about the fact that we remake tradition as we go, and we remake these things, right? That we reconstituted. Indigenous peoples have always been people who move, they're diasporic too, or like in conversations, like the first poem I read is really about the frictions that exist sometimes, the racism against Black and then sometimes the anti-Indianness in Black communities, right? That also exists, that we have to put all the ugliness also on the table. That's Thrivance is also about putting our shit out there, being honest about it, and that I always tell people, confrontation is not a bad word. The root of confrontation means to confront. How can you ever address something if you're not willing to confront it, right? And I think we have to move away from individualistic, right? That kind of, like I said, the idea of a meritocracy, when we've already, right, there's this mediocrity that we allow to exist from, folks who aren't folks of color or who aren't Black and Indigenous. That's another thing I'm gonna have to say, right? These moves and shifts, I get BIPOC to a certain extent, but I'm like, just say who you're talking about. Like, why are we making more things, right? Or Latinx, right? And adding an X, or all these things. Sometimes it's like, actually be specific and say who we're talking about, right? But let's also push back on how colonization has defined Blackness and indigeneity. Who can be Black and who can be Indigenous? If you're too light, right? Or you don't look, right, supposedly Black, or if you aren't enrolled. And then I think about particularly the fact that we say, oh, there's what, 2% or something. I think we talked the other day, I'd asked you like about your percentage of Native people at Netflix. But then what I didn't ask you is how many Latinos are at Netflix? How many Black folks are at Netflix, percentage wise? And are they also Native people, right? Part of the problem is, of course, we don't want Indians and Blacks people to exist. This country used different strategies, right, to eradicate, like the dispossession of Native people, right, the displacement of land. Basically wanted Native people to disappear and marry into white communities and basically dissolution. And then we were just, let's disenfranchise Black folks. I will say that a lot of times we have these things out here that say, you can't have Black liberation without American self-determination, Native self-determination. These dichotomous kind of things, so as if Black folks don't also need self-determination and Indigenous folks don't need liberation. I think what happens is we create these dichotomous kind of things. Even as more people are writing about Black and Indigenous communities, they do so as if they are discrete, separate communities, as if there aren't people who, like I said, you have the Lumbee, the Pequot, what do you think Puerto Ricans are? Come on, so it's a very, it's Mexico, all of these communities, the Americas is washed in Black and Indigenous brilliance and history and culture and language, and we forget that, right? That when we think about it, think about this land base, when we say the land matters, and you touch that, you can feel the pulse of your ancestors who come before, and they are Black and Indigenous peoples. And why I say that too is people of African descent who came here, they're Indigenous because of their indigeneity as African peoples, but they are actually also Indigenous to this land. We only know this space. It's not, and that's not said in the way to displace First Peoples or many people here too. And let's be real, right? Like Native people have moved about as well on this land space. So anyway, all of this to say, DEI is cute, but it's not enough. And we have to, I think I did a talk for some folks a while back, and we talked a lot about gatekeepers. And I think in the corporate world, a lot of it's about gatekeeping and what's allowed to be said and done and how it's represented. But are there real commitments and relationships? So to go beyond that, the decolonial work would be not just to do the land acknowledgement, let's work on how do we give some land to Black and Indigenous folks or Native folks, to create the kind of work we want to see to allow people to thrive. Yeah. And we have
Beautifully
two
said.
more, I think. Yeah. Mhm.
Beautifully said. Couldn't help but laugh at DEI is cute, but we have a lot of work to do. As a follow-up question to that, is there a way that DEI can be transformative as opposed to just reforming the systems that continue to replicate themselves to keep us where we're at?
I think it can be, but I think that's only possible if we reframe the way we talk about it. For me, words matter. That's why I said I don't want to ally. I don't want. So I think it's really important that we actually even shift. So like, what does it mean if we just say diversity? What does it mean when we're saying like, what do we mean by those words actually? Like, do we just mean we're going to have more physical representation of different looking bodies at a table? But if we're not going to listen to them, I mean, look at a place like Brazil and South Africa where they've had Black and brown majority populations forever, but they are still dominated by minority populations. So, just because we bring in, the speakers, how often are folks talking about Native and Indigenous issues or Black issues besides when it's Black History Month or American Indian History Month? Or, oh, Thanksgiving's coming. Oh, well, that's still American Indian history. So these need to be daily conversations. So if we want it to be transformative, I think it's really about assessing the institutional culture and really shifting what that looks like and being so creative, being so innovative, that we move to sort of, like I said, a more collective rather than individualistic approach. I think about when you go to a doctor. So let's connect this to wellness. When you go to a doctor, you're going to a stranger. That's such a colonial, and that we could mark that's a colonial structure. That's what I'm getting at. That we have to deconstruct these things, that some stranger is going to look at my body, the most intimate parts of myself, and then tell me what's wrong or judge that, right? Or you go to a therapist, right, for mental health, which there's been changes and better things with that. And I've done this before with people, and please, it's probably a trigger warning. I apologize if, but I look at the word therapist, and someone showed me this a long time ago, and it was very interesting because if you look at the word therapist, there's an irony in this of, to me, where you go in, maybe you're not actually going in because you're a sexual assault survivor, potentially, but it could be any number of other issues. But rape is ultimately a thing about power, right? And control and domination. And so I think the metaphor being here is going into therapeutic sessions where historically it's actually been about abusing women, queer, disabled, Black, Indigenous, people. Look at these histories of forced sterilizations. And so that then you go back in and all of a sudden you're being re-traumatized all over again because that's an individualistic approach. I would say in an African and Indigenous American Indian context, that wellness is about a collective. I can't thrive if there's something, you pull that circuit out, that's why I'm using it again, right? It's not going to function. If you pull one of the pieces out, we all play a role in making something work. And so so I think it can be transformative if there's serious change, right? In how people, and that there's relationships with communities, not just create memorandums of understanding about what your commitments are going to be after the staff that work at Netflix now are no longer there, right? What are your institutional long-term commitments? What do you see in 20, 25 years? And what are you going to do about, right, all the pollution of land and water, right, where these offices are often located? So anyway, I'm going to stop there. I know you had I think maybe one more question.
I do. For this question, one word comes up: authenticity. Authenticity has been a word that has, in many spaces, for one or another, bred feelings of insecurity, whether it be our day-to-day, like imposter syndrome, or systemically, like blood quantum and ongoing racial trauma. What authenticity fails to capture is the variations of lived experiences, that there is more than one way of being anything. Can you tell me of a time when you pushed against those fixed narratives of authenticity? And what does that path look like for you as a queer mixed race person?
Oh God, probably my whole life. It's been hard. I tell people often in stories, I'm like, I flunked the first grade. I like to tell my students that. And I said, how do you flunk the first grade? You take bad naps? What's going on? This is in the early 1980s. They had tracked classrooms still. Ironic. It hasn't failed me as a 6-year-old that I remember this years later. And I'm like, oh, the only other person who flunked also was this mixed half black, half white. I don't know if he was also Native or not, student. Eventually I skipped back or whatever, I guess, my grade. But I guess I raised that to say, there's the whole note. I feel that is what we could do. What could DEI do, to go back to the previous question? Help us to understand that there's no such thing as authenticity in the sense of one's identity. I was talking to a student and we were talking about even notions of desire, right? That those are socially constructed. Marriage, the idea that we have to get married, the idea that we have to go to college, like the idea that we have to do anything is actually pretty socially constructed, right? The way that we're supposed to do it, how we're supposed to do our work, right? That we care, and shifting these things. So one of the first poem I read was actually about a response actually to an issue that came up last year, where a Native journalist had actually created a pretend Indian list and was spreading it all over the country, which there is a problem with people who are making fraudulent claims about being American Indian. However, in her list, she attacked people who are actually adopted, a lot of folks who are Latinx, because they're not real Indians because they don't have federal recognition. So they're not First of all, let me disabuse folks of something. You're no more authentic or real than my tribe just because you're recognized by the United States government, because the United States government is a colonial government and they've recognized you maybe for a reason, right? They don't want, right? Because when you think about it, when people would go down into Louisiana, when I did research for my first book or my dissertation on Louisiana Creoles, because they were always talked about, oh, these light-skinned, uppity, like Black people who speak French, right? I'm like, it's much more complicated than that. And so what I really, understood was, what are all these cultural practices and connections, and where are the conversations about the indigeneity of like a group like Louisiana Creoles? And then by extension, I started thinking about other sort of what I would call Caribbean or Latin-based kind of influenced cultures as opposed to Anglo-based cultures, right? So, started thinking about Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Mexicanos and Haitianos, Haitians, all these, different communities, but also even within the US, and then also in Canada, when we were sort of looking at these relationships. And so it was interesting, this person who did this, I was like, oh, Andrew, be quiet. You always want to, because something had happened several years before, and then someone will point something out to me. So another Black Native, she's Muskogean Black, Melanin Muskogee, Amber Starks. Amber had posted something and saying, oh, there's another list out there of the fake Indians, but it's targeting Black Indians. And I was like, okay, I've had enough. So of course, in my big mouth, I take to the internet and call this person out, and then it got back to her. So what did she do? She came for me. She's like, well, maybe you. And then her minions, like these people she was working with, which was interesting. But it's funny, they're all white passing mostly, except for the main person who started it, the journalist, and I use that loosely, since she's been fired from several of her journalistic jobs for being messy. And you got to call messy people out. A lot of times people are being messy for a reason. You got to wonder why. And so it's interesting to see these white passing folks, because they have a tribal ID card from the US government. Never mind, quote unquote, we won't get into like blood quantum politics, but at the end of the day, I was like, we're in the middle of COVID. We're missing more, Black trans women and American Indian women. There's an event happening here locally for missing, murdered Indigenous women this weekend. that's something Netflix can, let's talk about that. Let's do a campaign to talk about missing, Black women, American Indian women who don't get talked about. But instead of her using her platform, she decides to go after all these people, including adoptees. I will say, again, some of the, but what gives you the right? You're from one particular community to then go after all others. And then when she starts digging in mine, let me just give you this quick example, and then you'll know why authenticity is a problem. So she starts digging, and then I said, well, here's a letter from my tribe that I'm enrolled, but then we're not state or federally recognized. But we're not, because we're racially mixed. And in Louisiana, for the longest time, they had a 3-tier racial system. They had white, what they called colored, and Black. So anybody who was quote unquote mixed or free people of color, they maybe didn't even have to be mixed, but if they weren't enslaved, then they were in the colored category. American Indians were in the colored category in Louisiana until the 1920s, until an act passed. That's when the Anglos came in, as opposed to the Latin folks that were there. So the Anglicization of Louisiana, they're like, ooh, let's get with the Indians so we can try to get the land, right? It really was, right, this sort of dispossession. But what you also have happen is that there's an erasure there. So when this person who has no idea about the land or the territory where I'm from, because she's from, actually, she's not even from there, she's from Cleveland, but her family and family lines are from Arizona, I believe, and New Mexico, and South Dakota. But you have no knowledge about where I'm from, but you have the audacity to come tell me whether I'm authentic or not, because you went and looked and did some, excuse me. And then she uses ancestry.com as her source as a genealogist. Well, if you saw the word colored on there, guess what? they're Indian or Black and Indian, and you aren't seeing these things. So just basic examples, or even when I think about students I've had in class who were racially mixed, or maybe they weren't. I had students, for example, from Mexico, who are like, I don't feel like I'm really a Latina because I got blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm like, have you been to Jalisco? I'm like, there's plenty of blonde hair, blue eyes. It doesn't mean that you're not authentically native, or excuse me, not native, but in that case Mexicano, where they were kind of fighting themselves on that issue. Or queer people who are like, well, I don't really do this, I'm not. Stop telling other people tell you what you have to do to be able to be a queer person, a woman, a trans person, right? A Black person, an Indigenous person. I remember, Filipino students. Well, I didn't grow up in the Philippines. I don't feel like I'm really Filipino. There's different ways to be Filipino. It doesn't mean that you all have, and that's what I was talking to the student about in terms of desire. What we accept, like the whole idea that we feel like we're supposed to perform our sexuality in particular ways, or what is acceptable, what's not, is a colonial construct. They tried to weed that out of Black and American Indian communities, which we might talk about as two-spirit or same gender loving people, and then did such a good job that then those communities internalize it and say, queerness is an invention of colonialism. No, it's not. Homophobia is an invention of colonialism. So, I think that's what we have to really do, is to do what I call citizenship refusal, right? That rather than being in citizenship, right? Because that is something that someone can take from you. You can't take my kinship relationship from you, though, right? So I think that's really important. And you had asked me about relational embodiment. It's actually something I talk about in this new article, but relational embodiment really about, how do I embody the relationship and the connection that I have to you? How do you all embody the relationships that you have to one another, not just as co-workers, but as a community?
Howie, thank you for that. That was beautiful. And this is my last question, and we're going to be closing out. Thank you all for staying as long as you have. What has been bringing you joy lately, and how are you going to take care of yourself today?
Music always brings joy. I'm a foodie. I know you know that. I love to cook. I love to feed people most of all. And I love to cook things that I grew up eating, or maybe didn't even know as much about, but that are from, where my dad and my mom's families are from. And that really, brings me a lot of joy. And also though, just I've been hearing a lot from those relatives that I'm saying, that relationship, those former students, maybe that I've worked with, and just seeing and hearing how they are thriving, how they are a circuit in that constellation of sacred gifts that Creator's given us, that each of them that is now doing something. I think I had mentioned this to you the other day, maybe. The California Community College system has created a ethnic studies council. And I said, oh, I want to go to this meeting because we were starting one in the UC where I work, and the California State University system has had one as well for many years. So I go to this community college ethnic studies council meeting. So it's a statewide thing. And I'm like, oh my God, there's like 12 of my former students here. They're all teaching in community colleges or at colleges or doing ethnic studies work. There's your example of the circuits and the Thrivance circuitry, right? That, I said this to my mother, or in a poem when she passed away. She died of breast cancer. It's be 10 years later this year. And maybe this is another example I'll share briefly. I said, every good thing I do, I will do because of you. When I flunked the first grade, my mother took me to our bathroom. I wasn't tall enough to look in the mirror. She had me stand on the tub and look in the mirror, and she said, Andrew, I want you to say, I am somebody, and repeat it 3 times. I said, I am somebody, I am somebody. I'm 6 years old. The fact that that stuck in my head, and then into adulthood, and then started talking about that, she knew in that moment the gift, I think, she was giving me, to the permission. You go thrive anyway. You go thrive anyway. I see a Jolivette in here. Hey now. And with the original spelling, I think there's Jolivette. Hey, Ken, folks. And so, I think that in that moment, it was so powerful. And I'm going to end with this because it was interesting, full circle. So she passed in 2012. 2013 would be the first Mother's Day I would have spent without her. I was supposed to go to Cuba. I told my dad, I was like, I don't know, I'm not feeling it. I don't know if I want to be gone. It's right during Mother's Day. He's like, your mom would want you to go. You should go. So I get there. My mother's name's Annetta. I get there, and I arrive. There's a couple folks who will be doing translation, and one of them is an Afro-Cuban woman. Her name's Annette, not Annetta. But the fact, and then she and I have built such a bond since then too, but even while there, but she calls me her son, even though she's not probably old enough to be my mom, but she calls me her son. Because I told her, I shared this story with her and how I was struggling. And the very last session, we went there for an anti-homophobia week that Cuba has. And we went to all these different sessions on public health, and Cuba does actually great work on trans rights stuff. And so we went to this last session though, and it was this program called Alas por Vida, Wings for Life. And it was a group of women who are survivors of various types of cancer. I listened there and I was like, oh my God, they have like this sisterhood. I wish my mom had this. Like, she lived in that. Remember I said about going to the doctor and having that fear and that individual rather than having that community that lifts you up, that radical love, that Thrivance, that circuitry. And so I felt her spirit push me up as these women had finished talking, because I do have folks have questions. And as I shared my mom's story and thanked them and began to weep, I mean, the whole room, we're all weeping by the time I think I was done talking. I said, I wish my mom had something like this. It's like a sisterhood that you have. And so joy, healing, radical love, Thrivance, as you think about Black folks, Black Indigenous folks, as you think about all people, all relatives, all living things, think about that circuit, think about that connection. Wings for life. Wings for life. I am somebody, and so are you. Thank you so much. Whale.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful and a beautiful ending to our conversation today. Chioko etes yavu. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope all of you have a beautiful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Hawaii, mighty. Yeah, a tribe called